Hi everyone, and welcome to the Cybersecurity Sauna. My name is Janne Kauhanen, and I will be your sauna majuri and the host of this podcast. Thank you for joining us for another session where we sweat out the hot topics in security. Welcome to all listeners, and be sure to follow us on Twitter at Cybersauna. There's a lot of different ways to collaborate on infosec problems. There's no shortage of associations, conferences, and other frameworks organizations can use to find others to work with. There's also a healthy supply of security companies to choose from. But do any of the above offer concrete benefits to organizations? Will organizations somehow achieve better outcomes by working with others? Or is it more complicated than that? Today we're joined by UK-based Julia Ward, WithSecure's principal client and markets liaison, and Tom Van de Wiele from Denmark, a former red teamer and current principal threats and technology researcher for WithSecure. Welcome to the show, guys. So why is it important for organizations to work together?
Well, I think one of the primary reasons is the widely acknowledged skills gap we have in the info security industry as a whole. There just aren't enough people in the industry to solve all the problems. And if you look at one organization, the problems that they might be facing, it's very rare that they'll be able to solve those alone. So actually collaborating with other organizations, with external experts in niche areas is really important if you have a hope to sort of solving any of those challenges.
What do you think, Tom? Do you recognize that?
Absolutely. And not just that. I mean, if you look at the sheer amount of security conferences that we have right now, probably, surpassing the medical industry, they aren't just about finding out about new products. They're also about just finding out how other businesses or people in your business sector are performing, how they're seeing the world, who they're working with. So being able to forge those partnerships and make them a two-way street as far as sharing successes, but also failures is becoming more and more important.
Okay. And like overall skill shortage aside, I guess there are specific niche areas where, for example, I'm thinking like incident response, like your average organization hopefully doesn't have too many major incidents a year. But our incident response guys were dealing with a major incident, earlier this morning. So, they're in a better, athletic shape in that area. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's knowing who to bring in when and what kind of support you need. It's always got to be about that big picture for the organization. Everything is, it's important to be able to see through information overload sometimes. So as an organization, there is a lot of information out there. There are a lot of vendors out there. There are all sorts of people telling you what you need. But it's really important, I think, to be able to contextualize on the basis of, what is your business doing? What is it that you need to protect? What is it that would be, at the end of business for you? What would stop you operating? And knowing how to protect those things fundamentally is what should be guiding the kind of security you might need and the kind of advice you might need and when you might need it. I think it's useful to reach out to partners to help you to see through the noise of some of what you might be being told by, marketing or even at conferences, as, Tom was saying. Seeing through the noise is quite important.
No, that makes sense. And you're giving some fairly practical advice there. And I definitely want to get back to that in a minute. But let's get philosophical for a second before that. So what I want to understand is what is this sort of true collaboration that we're talking about? And how is that different from just buying and selling services, for example?
So from my perspective, collaboration is about trust and it's about a long-term picture. So, empathy is crucial. You can't properly collaborate together if you don't see the world from the other person's perspective and actually then sort of meet in a consensus of shared opinion and shared expertise to move forward. And also, I think it's really important to add a dose of positivity. Collaboration should be about how do we solve this problem, not sort of can we solve this problem. And I think that's a really the right way to look at things. And it's about, again, if you consider the long-term goal of what you're trying to achieve with collaboration, there will be a way to solve the problems that you have together. But there needs to be an openness, there needs to be empathy, and that dose of sort of positivity, trust, and importantly, I think also accountability for the fact that there will be an outcome, that it isn't just, for example, asking for somebody's advice during one meeting and then that expert sort of leaves the building and you're left with, okay, so what do we do with that advice? How do we implement it? 3 months down the line, what did they say again? What should we do at this point? Because something's changed. It has to be continuous. I think it has to be an open dialogue. For me, that's what makes collaboration work.
I mean, in the security industry, we keep talking about best practices, but we never really unpack that. How do we know which ones are the best practices? Is it because we did a lot of things that either didn't stick or didn't work or weren't compatible with your culture or whatever it is? When we talk about these best practices, we need to have an open channel to be able to share the things that we have done or have tried in information security. And certain things worked and others didn't, or maybe, certain things worked out, but people have a lot of things to share by saying, look, we wouldn't have done this in this way again if we knew, X, Y, Z. So being able to share those things in a environment where that's possible is crucial in making sure that these partnerships work and that we can have the best information at our fingertips to make an as good decision as we can for implementing a new thing or getting rid of a piece of technology, a merger, whatever it is that might involve cybersecurity.
But that's a relationship significantly more deeper than just like one-off, we need your advice on this one thing. And sort of in the spirit of be careful whose advice you buy. Like if I'm a CISO or somebody like that in a company, how do I know who's a good partner for me? Like who's a true collaborator and who's just out to make a quick buck? Like what are the sort of tests or questions that I can ask?
So I don't know if there are specific questions that come to mind, but certainly you can tell, I think, if somebody's genuinely interested in the broader business and your overall, I guess, your challenge landscape. So if somebody is talking to you about one specific thing and not actually interested in the rest of it, so you might have gone to them with one quite specific challenge, let's say, but really they should be trying to understand where's that challenge come from and where's the advice going to help. So what kind of repercussions will the advice have? How is it going to help the person that's asked for the advice in the first place? I think it's very rarely a case of one answer to one question and stepping away from that conversation and job done. There's not really a tick box that you can apply to most conversations in security. It goes much broader than that. There is always another story or a larger story that you're trying to also get an understanding of in order to offer the right advice at the right time. To use an example of penetration testing, a client will maybe ask us to perform a penetration test of an application for them so that they can, apply internal process to application development. Maybe they need a tick in a box to say, this application has been tested. It's much more useful for them to say to us, we need assurance around this application because it sits in this wider environment that we know is a likely attack path, let's say, to some data we really care about. This is where it sits in the wider context. Here's a network diagram. And then use the expertise of the consultant to say, okay, well, we can do a penetration test. We'll also give you some advice maybe around the architecture in which this application sits or some of the likely attacks that you might need to prevent. So in terms of remediation advice, for example, if we were to find some vulnerabilities during that penetration test, understanding what to do with the information and how to fix it and how to move forward is much more useful to the clients ultimately from asking us to engage on that test than just simply doing the test and saying we found these vulnerabilities.
Sure, but like at the same time, like you're a security manager and your tasks this year is to do assessments on all these different applications. So where do you find the time to have that conversation with every single vendor or every single project?
That's a really good point. I think time is often a really critical factor in security decisions. Do we have time to test this the way we would want to? Often not, actually. So it has to be about prioritization. What I would say is the more information you can give a partner, you can give a vendor, the better outcome you could expect. So if you perhaps just have the big picture to begin with, let's say you do have 50 apps you need to test in 1 year. Paint the picture initially of just, okay, what are the apps? Do you have a prioritization yourselves? Do you need somebody maybe to help you at the beginning? Set prioritization or set, risk understanding of those 50 apps so that you can work through it in the most productive way. It is a challenge. I've worked with lots of organizations who do have lists. They need to get through the lists. They need to submit the vulnerabilities. There is a whole chain of events that happens around that. So we need to also, I think, as security experts, understand the pressures that clients are under from that perspective as well. It's actually a really difficult business to be in to maintain assurance across a number of applications at once. But meeting in the middle somewhere with the context and the story and the risk prioritization is important in order to achieve outcomes rather than just ticks in boxes.
Yeah, 100%. So, okay, obviously the relationship between an organization and security or service vendor is an important partnership, but what other kind of cooperative frameworks can organizations benefit from joining?
There are a number of organizations that are geared up towards threat intelligence sharing. So it's very likely whatever industry an organization operates in, there will be some kind of threat intelligence sharing forum going on. There is also good advice often from local government-backed security organisations, for example, a national cybersecurity centre. You will find that there are pockets of funded advice. So, for example, in the UK, the National Cybersecurity Centre writes really clear guidance, but also facilitates conversations between industries around what cybersecurity challenges are emerging, what maybe could be common ground for best practice. And there are also local initiatives to support smaller businesses with cybersecurity guidance. So it's really about going out there and trying to find what's happening locally, what you can join. And I would suggest join a few things and see which ones work for you. And just as a last point, also look for cross-industry conversation. It's quite, it's easy to fall into, I think, a bit of an echo chamber sometimes when it comes to discussion forums, particularly within one industry vertical. It's very interesting to look at what other industries are doing or what organisations that are different to your organisation are doing, because there are often learnings that can be swapped and ideas that can spark that otherwise wouldn't have sparked just speaking to people who are, the same kind of organisation in the same industry as yours.
I think it's also about asking the right questions, because even if departments of a certain organization or company reach out to, say, a technical partner or a cybersecurity partner, they're typically going to have a number of questions. Being able to forge a partnership with those kinds of organizations also means being able to question those assumptions as far as what are you going to use this for? And also to kind of use, a more pragmatic way of looking at things and saying, look, the results will probably be in these three categories. What are you going to do with these results? So I kind of like to compare it to, going to the doctor, where, you might visit the doctor 5 times a year and you will have very specific questions as far as, my knee hurts or I have this or that complaint. I mean, the doctor is the definition of outcome-based security. They want to maintain your health, which is why hopefully the doctor asks you, how's your health? Because all of these things fit into the bigger picture where hopefully the doctor has a file on you that says, if I make recommendations, maybe do not suggest the ones for which you have allergies or for which there is a proven track record that it is not going to work or not come to the actual desired outcome. So being able to ask those questions, because even though, some engagements might just be a single penetration test, an audit, a review, an interview, it does take discipline that we like to take into doing the extra effort in building that file, in building that awareness about what business sector are you in? How can we help you now to be able to help you later so that we can anticipate what that organization wants to do with their business so that we can give better advice, better recommendations, and ultimately, have more value towards those particular organizations.
So as an organization who's looking for partners and collaboration in security area, what sort of impacts can I expect? What's realistic? What sort of positive outcomes is it realistic to expect?
So I think it's not realistic to expect one solution or one test to solve your problems. It's not realistic to expect perfect security, and it's not realistic to expect an end state almost. There is no sort of 100% security state out there to achieve.
My security is now done.
Exactly. So there has to be an understanding of continuous improvement and an understanding, I think, of the kind of processes or the kind of practices that you want to get better at and what might enable those. So to refer briefly to quite a well-known security framework, the NIST cybersecurity framework, actually the adaptive tier of NIST is all about sort of how well do you operate as a security organization? How flexible are you to deal with changing environments? Do you have processes in place? Do you have people that understand what you're doing with those processes, as well as the technology elements and what tooling can you buy to help you achieve your overall security aims? But I think we should be focusing on security activity and continuous improvement as being the right kind of outcomes rather than, if you like, quick wins, although they're nice to have along the way.
All right. So now I know what to sort of expect from the partners around me, but what should my organization, looking to get into this collaboration state, what should I be prepared to do to be a good partner to others?
It's important to be open and willing to let your guard down, I think, a little bit. So I spoke about trust. I think trust is really important when it comes to real collaboration. You need to approach a conversation without ego in order to have a fruitful discussion when it comes to collaborative partnership. So being able to admit where there are failings or where there are real pain points, where you think perhaps there are going to be challenges and hurdles. It's often the case for security teams that within an organization, it's not an easy ride to make a decision and have that decision implemented all the time. There are not just constraints on budget and resource, but also just the importance of security to the rest of the organization. So when collaborating with a partner outside the organization, be clear on what you think those challenges might be. Be open as much as you can about what you're worried about. It's much easier for somebody to empathise with your situation if they can understand where you're coming from. And it's much less useful to talk only about a security problem without that context, because the response is only going to be as good as the information the person has. So I would just say, be open. That's the key for me for good collaboration from the organization's perspective when they're talking externally.
That makes sense. But what if my business is something fairly rigid? Let's say I'm a SaaS provider, for example. This is my product. I'm selling it to my clients. So how do I now turn this commercial relationship into a collaborative one?
I would say share your business roadmap. What's the business trying to achieve? Often in security, we are in a bit of a bubble and we think about security within security. It's useful to remember what the point of security is. It's to enable the business. Understanding an organization's business plan, no matter what kind of business, there will be a direction, there will be things that the business wants to achieve. Understanding how security can enable that is important, and that can be done, I think, with any kind of organization.
I think it's also important to actually, again, ask the right questions as far as why do we want this service? What are we going to use it for? And what do we do if tomorrow it's no longer there? So sometimes, it's all fine when everything works and everything runs smoothly. The problems start when things do not run smoothly, or when you get spotty service, or when expectations are not being met. So being able to go through that list and ask the more maybe inconvenient questions is going to pay off later on, knowing that there are certain constraints at companies when it comes to vendor lock-in, when it comes to how much data can be used by third parties. And I think all the rest really, really flows from that. Security ultimately should be an enabler, but it should also not become a thing where you paint yourself into a corner. And now we need to find different ways of living with that particular constraint, like a lot of companies are doing, for example, in the fintech industry, where they're very much dependent on legacy infrastructure that cannot be changed or is very costly to change. So being open about those challenges, being able to share failure or things that haven't gone right, because there's too many success stories to my taste in cybersecurity. The complaint departments of unopened parachutes are very small. They hardly get any calls, but that's really where we should be learning. So why can't we, make this a more common thing of asking these questions and saying, we understand what you are about and what you provide, but please also see how we intend to use your service. Do you think this has a future, and what should we be careful about? But again, it becomes a little bit uncomfortable, and you need good partners around the table that can look each other in the eye and talk about, the constraints and limitations as well, because ultimately it is IT. It is not made of magic.
I like what you're saying. And we have a tendency in this industry to talk about everything like it's a huge paradigm shift. But I'm actually sort of thinking that this might actually legitimately be one of those cases. So whether you're a company that relies on services or that provides them, building this true collaboration with your partners seems to me that you have to start doing and thinking things differently than before. Do you guys think that's accurate?
It's happening in some places and not in others. And it leads me to think actually about the wider implications of not just one organisation and their vendor, but also actually the national or societal impact of collaboration. And, we've seen advice and guidance given out, and even in some cases, regulation around when you should share if you've been hit by a cyber attack, for example. So, time to advising your local regulator that you have suffered some form of cyber attack. There's been, I think, a tendency to shy away from talking about being attacked. There's a tendency sometimes to hide failure. But if we do that, we're not learning. And then from a broader perspective, sharing a type of attack that has happened should be seen as a good thing to do. You're sharing actually really valuable information that other people can then use and look for the same kind of indicators of compromise, for example, so that attack is then stopped in its track. So it's not going to be successful in other organisations if they know that it's already been used, for example, in an organisation that's similar to them or that is likely to have the same kind of attack objective. So information sharing at a broad level, at a national level or at an industry level is a good idea, and people should be encouraged to feel able to share that kind of information without fear of, media attention, negative media attention, which unfortunately still seems to focus more on the fact that a company was breached as being a bad thing for the company, rather than focusing on the attacker. If a bank was robbed physically, no one would be necessarily talking so much about, well, what kind of doors did you have in place on the bank? You would be thinking, well, who are these people that have managed to break into the bank? What are they doing now? How are they getting away? How are we stopping them? And I think the way that breaches are reported still needs to change a bit to be more supportive of the people who have actually been attacked, rather than penalising them, if you like, for not having the right controls in place. Although, of course, people do still need to have a good security baseline. But I think a little bit of balance is important.
I don't know that this is an area that a lot of companies are very good at. Sort of, you're talking about this sort of collaboration, the sharing roadmaps, also, learning from clients' use cases, like Tom was saying, walking a mile in their shoes. Like, this is a skill, and I'm not sure that every organization has that skill.
That's true. I think it comes down to personalities as well, the kind of people in the organization, and whether they feel supported by the organization to speak openly or to share failure. It can also be part of company culture as to whether that's a good or a bad thing. So, of course, there are lots of variables. And I guess you have to start somewhere. And perhaps we could start, if you like, a ripple effect of people starting to share more will encourage others to do the same, and perhaps grow the number of organizations that feel comfortable to enter into that kind of dialogue.
So for a security vendor, it seems obvious to try to help organizations by giving them expert advice. How do I sort of then make sure that the advice, like the client knows how to put that into practice? Like, what's the difference between just giving the advice and helping the client sort of put it into practice?
So I think it's really important to give actionable advice. There's no point giving advice from an ivory tower and then walking away and just hoping it's going to be implemented. And I know that, from a consultant's perspective, and maybe Tom can speak to this, it could be frustrating to give an organization some really good advice, only to come back in 3 months to talk to them again, and actually nothing's really happened. The advice hasn't been actioned. But there are lots of reasons why that might be the case, and understanding what is possible and what's achievable in the organisation to begin with is important to consider when we're giving advice. There could be, for example, tiers of this would be really important for you to do. If you can also, manage to do this, this and this, all the better. But some kind of order of prioritization, for example, or in the case of looking specifically at attacker TTPs, for example, you might give advice relevant to indicators of compromise to look for. You might be giving really specific advice relating to the MITRE ATT&CK framework. But if the company you're talking to isn't that familiar with the framework, or they don't actually have a team in place who can hunt for those kind of IOCs on the network, then it's not really that useful as advice. So it's about understanding the context in which your advice is being given. But Tom, you probably have a view on that.
Ultimately, the risk lies with the organization that wants the advice, right? So that's kind of a given. But having said that, it is, as you mentioned, very important that we understand how the advice or the recommendations are being used, which means a single recommendation is probably not going to be the answer, knowing that everyone's threat model and roadmap is different. But with that, there should always be, different paths to get to the actual outcome of where the organization wants to be following, maybe an issue or a security challenge that we've discovered together. When it comes to the actual advice, as mentioned, it needs to be actionable. That is to say, it cannot be kind of a one-liner or something that is just kind of faxed in, so to speak. It needs to be adapted to the bigger picture of what the technical asset is supposed to do, or what process is supposed to establish, or what the bigger picture is. I keep saying that I have 4 cooking books and I have 3 fitness subscriptions, but I'm not losing any weight. That's because I've gotten some pretty bad advice, and I need to find a way of making that advice my own, of adapting it to my organization. And that takes expertise, that takes experience, and that takes a little bit of courage, because it's easy to kind of, add to the status quo of saying, we'll try to fix this thing, or we'll try to turn this thing off. But ultimately, some of the more Gordian knots are going to have to be cut in half. But as said, ultimately the risk is with the organization. Sometimes, certain things need to be accepted or can be sustained for a little bit longer. But it's important to also keep those things in mind when there's, further advice being given to these organizations.
I like that. That makes sense to me. You've decided that you want to be truly collaborative now. How do you make that into reality? How do you make that journey?
There are a few ways to look at it, but one thing to bear in mind is to have flexibility in what you're delivering. So it's obviously, commercially a good idea to have a certain set of services or products or capabilities that you can deliver to customers. But I think it's really important, if you're to look at a truly collaborative relationship with a customer and the longevity of that relationship, it's much more about any one of those services or products. So having flexibility in just the capability you have matched with the customer's challenges, it's much more valuable as a relationship and as a service. That might combine, for example, part of a service you already have, plus a product, plus maybe, something else. Being flexible with how you help a customer is really important.
Does that mean that you also have to be every now and then ready to say, like, look, I don't think we're the right mix, the right fit for you?
Yeah. And it's really important to be honest about things like that rather than trying to half fix a problem or not do a great job. And so absolutely, guidance is all about trying to solve the bigger problem and not necessarily solving the full problem in-house, through one vendor. It might take a mix of solutions to make something work.
Okay. Saying no is part of quality control as well. And it is very important that cybersecurity comes out of this stigma of just being the people that always say no. We need to be able to say why it's probably not a good idea at this point in time, and then actually back it up with better advice as far as what could be done instead. So I know it goes back to the old chestnut of connecting the wants and needs, but if we have partners that we do business with, projects, engagements, and we see that they're maybe not asking the thing that should be their first priority, one should be able to say no and say, look, you need to stop digging and you need to start fixing things. And you can only do that with an honest partner by your side that knows your strengths, but also your limitations.
And with that, I want to thank you guys for being with us today.
It's been my pleasure.
Thank you.
That was the show for today. I hope you enjoyed it. Please get in touch with us through Twitter with the hashtag Cybersauna with your feedback, comments, and ideas. Thanks for listening. Be sure to subscribe.